Hello everyone and welcome back to the match that we've already covered, but we only covered a game from board 3. This is a game from board 1, Fabiano Caruana representing United States versus Nodirbek Abdusattorov representing Uzbekistan, and as you guys know, Abdusattorov is the reigning world rapid champion, and the problem is Uzbekistan is losing by a full point. We've already shown the game that Wesley So won. It was that brilliant victory in 28 moves, and now Nodirbek wants to fight back, of course, but it's not easy. It's against Fabi and he does have the black piece, so let's see what happened in this one, as it's it's just very enjoyable. So Fabi has the white pieces and he opens with d4. We have d5 and bishop to f4, going for the London system, knight to f6 and e3. So there were a couple of interesting ideas about why Fabi would go for the London system, as it's he plays pretty much everything. He doesn't have to prepare, as he's better prepared than everyone else, but something that they mentioned during the live commentary is that Rustam Kasimjanov, who was second of Fabiano Caruana, is now training, or rather serves as a trainer for the Olympiad for the Uzbekistan team, and Fabi might be thinking that he knows a bit too much about Fabi's preparation. Maybe he gives them a bit too much insight, so maybe that's why he decided to mix it up. But okay, the London system is on the board. We have c5 and knight to f3. We have knight to c6 and knight b to d2. C captures on d4, E captures on d4, and now bishop to f5. And here we have bishop to b5. So Fabi not going for the standard c3 London. He goes for this line that has been played quite a few times between some very, very strong players. For example, Alireza Firuja defeated David Anton Guijarro, Levon Aronian defeated Ernesto Inerkiev, and there were a couple of very interesting games that featured this bishop to b5 move. So here, queen to b6, putting pressure on the bishop, and now Fabi plays c4. This is what he prepared, and it's quite an interesting and complicated line. So d captures on c4, and now we have pawn to a4, defending the bishop once again, and now bishop to d3, stopping Fabi from castling. We have knight to e5, attacking the bishop, and now attacking the c4 pawn 3 times, and there are, I believe, 2 games where a6 was played, but here we have e6 by Abdusattorov, and it is now, as of move 10, that we have a completely new game. So Fabi goes queen to f3. He still waits with the recapture on c4 and rook to c8. Getting the rook into the game. Knight captures on d3, eliminating the light square bishop. C captures, and now queen captures on d3, winning back the pawn. We have a6, attacking the bishop, and now knight to c4. So these are some of the complications that Fabi prepared. You don't have to move the bishop right away. You can go after the queen first. But now bishop to b4 with check. We have bishop back to d2. Bishop captures on d2. Queen captures on d2. And only now queen back to c7. Fabi trades on c6, bishop captures, and queen captures on c6. We have knight to e3. As the knight is attacked, we first have to move it before castling, so knight e3, and both players castle. So castles, and now knight to e4, and this is what Fabi got out of the opening. It's not all that much equal material. Abdusattorov's knight a bit better placed than Fabi's knight on e3. Also, he does have full control over the c file, but it's fair to assume that Fabi knows the position much better, and there will be a move that will be so great that I mean, you have to have prepared this at home. So here, queen to b4, now putting pressure on that b7 pawn, so the queen can't really leave the c6 square. Rook f to d8, and now pawn to a5. So now controlling both of the pawns with the a pawn. Knight to d6, remaneuvering the knight, and now rook f to d1. We have knight to b5, putting pressure on the d4 pawn, and this is the move I had in mind. Here, Fabi doesn't want to just wait for Abdusattorov to double up rooks here, put more pressure on this d4 pawn. Even the queen can join the action, and he plays pawn to d5. He sacrifices the pawn just to win the f5 square for his knight. Now, the problem is you have to capture with the pawn. If you play rook captures, of course, we're just going to capture the rook, so that's out of the question. So the only way to really enjoy this pawn is to capture it with the e pawn. So e captures on d5, and now Fabi plays knight to f5, and this is basically what Fabi got out of his opening and preparing the London system for this game. Now he has a beautifully active f5 square for the knight, and he's already threatening knight to e7 check, which will be a monster forking absolutely everything, but Abdusattorov strikes back incredibly well. He plays queen to c5. Now this is very nicely defended, because if you trade, for example, queen captures, rook captures, now there is no rook on c8 for you to fork. And also, if you try knight e7 check right away, there's king f8. This is what Abdusattorov had in mind. And now if queen captures, rook captures, there is no good way to play this. The only way to survive this is to play b4, but still it's not going to be all that great. Rook c4, knight captures on d5, and now knight to d4. Cutting off the rook's defense of the knight. Now rook captures on d5 is coming, so you have to move it rook captures on b4, and Abdusattorov would get to enjoy this position, being up a pawn against Fabi. Would it be enough for a win? It's hard to say, but it would be very enjoyable. So instead, after queen to c5, Fabi goes queen to h4. Of course, he doesn't want to trade queens. He sacrificed the pawn for the attack, and now we have pawn to f6. This is you don't have to play it, but it's I mean it definitely comes in handy. Here Abdusattorov's idea is f6 g6, and then he wants to get his king to the 7th rank, because here let's say you try something like you play king to h8, you already fall for knight captures on g7, and now it's very difficult for black to play this. If Fabi wants, he can even just force a nice perpetual here with something like this. So of course, Fabi doesn't want to force a perpetual, but you know, you don't if you don't have to give him the option, better not give him the option. So here f6, and now we have queen to g4, now just threatening checkmate. And again, you have to be careful if you defend it with something like rook to d7, then there are ideas like knight h6 check, picking up the rook. So here Abdusattorov has to play it incredibly precisely. Rook to c7 is one nice way to do it, just defend it like this and get everything away from this diagonal, but he goes g6, chases away the knight, knight to d4, and now he trades off a pair of knights, captures, and now king to f7. So he did weaken his king a little bit, but it's questionable if Fabi can do something about this. Fabi starts the attack again, h4. Now comes queen to b5, making room for the rooks to infiltrate, also putting pressure on the b2 pawn. So here just rook to e1. Fabi says feel free to go after this pawn, but if you capture on b2, then just queen to e6 with check, and now you are you're just getting destroyed. So instead, rook to e8, we have to counter that rook on the e file, and now rook e back to d1. Fabi, of course, not interested in trading. He wants as many attackers as possible, as this king is not as safe as Fabi's king on g1. So here, rook to c4, offering a trade of rooks. Now the rook cannot move as the queen would hang. And here we have a trade. Rook captures on c4, d captures on c4, and now Fabi again continues with pushing of the pawn h5. Now if queen captures, you can capture on c4 with check. So instead we have g captures on h5, not being afraid of anything, and queen to f4 now by Fabi. Again, having access to h6, having access to c7. So it could be very dangerous. For example, queen c7 check, then if the rook comes to d7, you get the picture. So here king to g6, now comes queen to c7, and rook to e4 now. We have queen to c8, now with ideas of delivering some back rank checks, and now rook to e8, chasing back the queen, queen c7, and now rook to e4. So will we see a repetition here? Abdusattorov says, I'm not so sure. Fabi does repeat queen to c8, but now queen to b4, putting pressure on that e1 square, but also the queen now has very nice access to e7 if needed. And here we have king to h2 by Fabi. If you wanna, you can immediately force a draw here with queen to g8. You can't go to f5 because you lose the pawn, and if you go king to h6, then queen h8. You threaten the f6 pawn, and now there's, well, not all that much black can do here to defend. Okay, you can go rook to f4, but safest is just to go for a nice repetition here, king h6, queen to h8, and get a draw. Fabi, not interested in this, plays king to h2, and and now we have queen to e7, making this move 39. So one more move has to be made to reach time control, and Fabi has like 2.5 minutes to make it, and it's an incredibly intense position. You have to be very, very careful. One thing you could, of course, do is queen to g8. We already discussed this, but Fabi plays pawn to g3. And this allows Abdusattorov to just go for the attack, and he does. He plays h4. So how do you play this? Queen to g8 with check, king to h6, now king to g2, and here we have pawn to f5. And this is basically where Abdusattorov loses all of his advantage, and everyone was criticizing him for making this move against Fabi. But as you'll see, it's not all that clear. Even the great Fabiano Caruana falters in this position. He does find queen to c8, which is the strongest reply, now having access to rook to d7, but after h captures on g3, you have to continue playing precise moves, but here Fabi plays queen captures on f5, and he blunders the game completely. Now the thing how you hold this is rook to d7. That's how you do it, and after queen to a8, offering a queen trade, queen captures on b7, going after the h6 7 pawn, and this is basically a draw. G captures on f2, you're going to capture on h7, king g5, queen to g7 check. Now you can block with queen to g6, captures, and now let's say rook to a7, and okay, black is up 2 pawns, but only for the moment. This is a draw. For example, rook f4, we're gonna capture this with check. If king g5, king f1, we stop the pawn. Now it's a doubled pawn, so not all that great. But like I said, queen captures on f5 was played instead, and this would work if there was not that one annoying move that wins the game for Abdusattorov. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find this incredible idea while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not grabbing the pawn. That wouldn't be all that great. If you grab the pawn, then you allow rook to h1 with check, and then you're never gonna win this, or you know, you're gonna have to accept pretty much an immediate draw. However, if you found rook to h4, then you are truly an incredible player, as this is the only move that wins the game for Abdusattorov. This is what he played, and now what do you play? The problem is, if you go rook to d7 now, which was always a good idea, if the queen moves, you can get, you can nicely checkmate the black king. The problem is rook h2 check, and now after king captures on g3, queen h4 check, and now you just get checkmated. King f3, rook captures on f2, the white queen falls, and that's it. So unfortunately for Fabi, he cannot do that. He has to play king captures on g3, but now comes rook to h5. Everything with tempo, not allowing any checks and not allowing this rook lift. And the problem is now you have to do something, because if queen h4 lands, then it's game over. So queen to f4 with check, but now Abdusattorov just plays queen g5, blocks check, and forces a queen trade, and the rook and pawn endgame does seem to be winning for him. So queen g4, he forces a trade, captures, and the rook to g5 check. King f4, and the rook captures on a5. He's now up 2 pawns. Rook to d6 with check. We have king to h5 and rook to d7. Fabi will win back at least one of those pawns. So rook b5, and now rook captures on h7 with check. King g6, rook to c7, going after this pawn, but now rook captures on b2. And now it doesn't matter. If you capture this, we capture here with check. 2 connected pass pawns, of course, this is completely winning. Both of them know this. So after king to e5, b5, defending the pawn, Fabi tries at least, okay, maybe I can push my pass pawn and then gain some counterplay. Rook c6 check, king to h5, now pawn to f4. We have a5, the race is on, pawn to f5, pawn to a4, and now if you go pawn to f6, then king here, the king guards the f7 square. So Fabi has to try something different. Rook to c8, we have pawn to a3, rook to h8 with check. Now king to g5, rook g8 check, king to h6. Here we have pawn to f6, and here rook to f2. And it was in this position on move 61 that Fabiano Caruana resigned the game. as there is nothing more to be done here. 3 pass pawns, connected pass pawns are just too much. For example, if king e6, a2, pawn to f7, you don't really care. You can just bring a queen into the game, and if Fabi brings a queen into the game, you just take it, and that's it. You have a rook and 2 pawns, a queen and 2 pawns against the rook, of course, completely winning. So really a wild game where it's interesting that, okay, Fabi, of course, is almost 100 rating points higher rated than Abdusattorov, and of course he wanted to push for a win. He tried basically everything from the opening choice to avoiding a draw by repetition many times throughout the game, and even his team was winning. As Wesley won that game very nicely, but there was a problem on one of the boards. Sam Shankland was completely lost on board 4 against Diakongir Vakidov, and that's probably why Fabi pushed for a win, so the United States could get a win. But in the end, it's Fabi who lost this game, and Shankland managed to get a draw on board 4. So the clash United States versus Uzbekistan ends in a draw with 2 draws and 2 decisive games. But you know, that's why team events are always very, very volatile, and the games are very interesting, because who knows how this game might have ended up if it was just a one-on-one and not a team event. But at the end of the day, it is Abdusattorov who takes down Fabiano Caruana in classical chess. So that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Big congratulations to Uzbekistan on this, well, I'm going to call it a victory, even though the match ended in a draw. I would like to thank David Kimura, Mikhaila Kalista, Harper Isla, Esmond Alden, and Jacob Tobias for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to cover the games from the Olympiad until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.